All right, thanks for stopping by. I am glad you are here. Let's talk about the world, the condition of the world. Let's talk about inflation and let's talk about privacy and the things you can't go do and have fun anymore without going to jail. you know, I listened to that song that got popular a couple of weeks ago. I finally heard it. It's by that bluegrass guy. I think he's in Virginia. Richmond, north of Richmond. And I thought, well, he's just saying what everybody's been thinking for 20 years, but he's a really good singer. He's got that great country sound to his voice and the chords of the song. And it's so heartfelt. When you put all that together, I can see why the song got popular. But I was talking with my brother just a little while ago, and we were talking about the cost of cars these days. He said his company rented a van so he can make deliveries because his van broke down that he used to use for the company. And he was curious to see what this van would cost. And he looked it up and it was $67,000. It was a Ford Transit high top. $67,000. And we were talking about, we remember when you could go get a good used car for $1,000 and drive it for like 2 or 3 years before it broke down. That's how things have changed. Inflation, they say it's at 5%. Come on. You got to think I'm crazy. Inflation's 10%. And it depends on which product you're talking about. Are you talking about groceries? Are you talking about energy and oil and gasoline and heating oil and electricity? Or are you talking about cars? It changes between, whatever product you're talking about. But it's probably closer to 9 or 10%. So I really feel for people who are under 30 or 35. I just think you'll never know what it was like. We had so much more freedom then, and your dollar went further, even though you didn't make as much. I remember my first job was $3.25 an hour. Yeah, I was stocking the shelves at Winn-Dixie. This was like 1987 or something like that. I remember my first paycheck was $80. That's something that's just burned into my brain. I looked at that check, I thought, wow, I worked a lot harder than $80. But you could get a car for $1,000. My first car was $2,000. Yeah, this was 1988. I think I was 16 or 17. My dad bought me a Toyota Corolla, but I had to pay him back. He set me up on a payment plan. And I remember one time missing a payment and he repossessed the thing. He did. He came and got it. He said, I'm going to teach you a lesson, boy. When you make the payment, you'll get the car back. Took the keys, took the car. Sure did. So I ended up getting a better job and made the payment, got the car back so I could get to work. But that was a good lesson in life. But I can't remember what the payment was. Maybe it was, I don't know, $80 to $100 a month. It was something really cheap, but it took me forever to pay that car off. But the good thing about it was, after I got it paid off, I drove the thing for years and years and years. And finally, it started having a problem with the rear wheel bearing. And I just sold it to a buddy of mine for about half what I paid for the thing. So that's another thing, the depreciation of vehicles. Now, if you get you a good Toyota or a good car, that's got a good long-standing reputation, you don't have to deal with so much depreciation. But back to that song, when I heard it, before I even heard the words to it, the way he starts out playing that, he's got this resonator guitar. It's kind of like half banjo, half guitar. You musicians out there will know what I'm talking about. It's called a resonator. And I like those a lot better than banjos. Some people call them dobros. I think that's a very similar instrument. But he starts playing and the hair on my arm stood up. I'm like, oh my gosh, this guy is so good. Because I like bluegrass anyway, because it was like America's music, It was like blues and bluegrass was created by people who were going through struggles and tough times, It hits you in the heart, hits you in the gut. In his song, talking about the dollar is not worth anything. He works overtime just to pay the rent. And, rent's outrageous. It was outrageous back in 2015. I think 2014 is when it started getting really crazy. And by 2018, I knew, there's no way out of this. I'm going to have to just work at least 60 hours a week just to pay the rent. So that's when I started looking into this van life thing. And, if you got the guts for it, van life's a good remedy for at least short term. Keep you from paying skyrocketing rent. And I would much rather do this than have a roommate. I've had roommates before. Nightmare. Total nightmare. I'd live under a bridge before I had a roommate again. It's just, maybe if you get lucky and have a good roommate, it's a different story. I really feel for the people 35 and under. I just think they're never going to understand what the American dream used to be. Now it's become the American nightmare. I remember I bought my first house. This must have been 97. I think it was 97. I bought my first house. It was a fixer-upper. And I didn't even get a mortgage for it. I just went to a bank and got a loan. I guess a personal loan. I didn't have escrow or anything. And I was working at a factory. And I was working nights. I worked nights, 12-hour shifts for almost 3 years. And I'd get home in the morning at sunup, and I'd start working on that house, And I lived in it a couple of years, flipped the house, and sold it for double what I paid for. And I thought, wow, the housing market's really going up. Next house I had didn't do so well on. And the house I had after that didn't do so well on. Because by now we're talking 2008. And I think when it was all said and done, I might have made $1,000 out of that house. After being in it for, 5-6 years. But I was lucky because other houses on my street sat for a year or so without selling. But, I prettied mine up really good. I cleaned up, I painted the shutters and planted nice shrubberies around the base of the house to make it real pretty from the curbside. And, my house sold within a month. Other houses sat for a year. But that's what cosmetic work will do for a house. If you make it pretty, when people pull up and they see the house and they smile, then the house is going to sell quick. But looking back at all those days of how the American dream became a nightmare, I could have been stuck with that house because I'd already moved to Florida while I was renting a place in Florida, still paying the mortgage on the house back in Alabama. It was tough times. And I just can't imagine if it was today, I might have a nervous breakdown. What you make versus what you spend on groceries alone. My goodness. And, it's getting where people can't afford to have a car. Insurance goes up, and the reason that's going up is because all these car break-ins. Well, that's not the whole reason, but that is a big reason. And, it's just no accountability. And there's counties all over the country where that's not considered a big crime. It's let them break in your car, bust your window out of your car, your property, reach in and steal all they can out of your car. And then they're never held accountable. They don't go to jail. Cops don't even track them down. But one thing they will do is they'll beat you up if you're having a beer in a cul-de-sac. Did you see that story about that guy? He's a landscaper, hardworking guy. He gets off work. He goes down to the end of this cul-de-sac where they've been working. And he decides he's going to pop a Modelo and have a beer with his friends as he gets off work. And they're down at the end of this cul-de-sac. There's nobody down there. Cops roll up. They ended up beating him up, Yeah. they'll beat up a guy trying to have a beer after work. But let somebody break into your car, they'll just go free. Petty crime, we're not worried about you. Everything's topsy-turvy, turned on its head. So I'm glad I just divorced myself from society, 3 years ago. Well, actually coming up on 5 years total van life. But yeah, I did. I just checked out of society. I think that a lot more people are going to start strategizing their escape plan, and they're just going to be done with it. I might recommend it for most people. It just depends on your personality. Depends on what you want to do. If you don't want to do it, do whatever you want to. That's fine with me. But it just seems like things aren't going so well for a lot of people. They're working their fingers to the bone. First thing is, don't care too much. Don't become too emotionally involved in what's going on in the world. Second thing is, try your best not to watch the news. But all this came about is because I watched the news for a day. I haven't watched the news in a year. Most of the stuff they're talking about doesn't concern me anyway. But when it comes to inflation, of course, that concerns all of us. But all this other stuff, they talk about crazy stuff that makes the national news that shouldn't make national news. Some guy in Washington wore a certain t-shirt at school and got kicked out of school. Why is that national news? Who cares if some kid wears a t-shirt at school? It's stuff like that. Just divorce yourself from it. I will try to not watch the news again for another year because, when you watch it, you're just like, this is laughable, but it still makes you wince up your forehead, because it's so ridiculous. So I will try to take my own advice, not watch the news. And another thing is, don't get too emotionally involved in anything. Ask yourself this: anytime something comes up that could worry you, think, what's it got to do with me? Is this a serious subject? Of course, inflation's a serious subject. Cost of living is a serious subject. We should pay attention to that. But I'm talking about the little nitpicky stuff they talk about on cable news. It goes 24/7. It never goes off. You know how they pull that off? Because they understand that there's a thing called sensationalism, and they understand how the human mind works. And they've got, 50 years of research to prove it. What gets you hooked in? What gets you upset? What gets you all angry? But the small little news stories that they run, they do that just to get you upset. Pay attention to the big stuff, though. Inflation is huge because that affects your livelihood. But the little stuff, forget about it. All right. Thanks for watching. Take care, be well, and smash the bell.